Do you ever wonder if God really cares about your life? Maybe you're going through something that has been very difficult and might have been difficult for many months, even years. And you've been praying and praying and praying, and it doesn't seem like you're getting a response. What do we do when God seems distant, when God seems nowhere in sight? The famed Catholic nun, Mother Theresa, even wrote in her journals that for the better part of her entire ministry years, she was experiencing a dark night of the soul in which she felt like God was distant. Well, last week we started studying the book of Exodus, and in chapter 1 and the early part of chapter 2, we learned how the family of Israel, Jacob, had grown into a nation and was enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. Imagine that. 400 years. You'd think they would have given up on God long before the 400-year mark. Did they? Had they forgotten the God who made covenants with their ancestors? Had they forgotten the God who was faithfully followed by their patriarchs? Well, though they were enslaved, the nation of Egypt continued to grow, and we learned that they grew even when the Egyptian king, the Pharaoh, who was fearing this ever-increasing nation in the borders of his nation, so he decreed that all Hebrew baby boys would need to be killed. And then we met a courageous Hebrew Israelite woman who gave birth to one of those baby boys, and she hid the boy from the Egyptians. But that could only last so long. And so when this mother could hide the baby boy no longer, which was right around 3 months of age, she put him in a waterproof basket and floated him on the Nile River near the place where Pharaoh's own daughter would bathe. Rather than obeying her father, Pharaoh's daughter had compassion on the baby. She eventually welcomed the baby boy into her home and named him Moses. That Hebrew baby boy, Moses, he became a prince in Egypt, adopted, but still a prince. His was the most unlikely upbringing. He enjoyed the best of the best. And yet, at the same time, his people were suffering. Think about what Moses' life would have been like. He would have enjoyed the best food, top-notch education, healthcare, experiences of life, safety and security. He was being trained as an Egyptian elite. In fact, it's so interesting to fast forward a couple of thousand years almost, to the early church deacon Stephen in his sermon in Acts chapter 7 and verse 22. He describes this. He's basically saying Moses hit the Powerball of life, and yet Moses is deeply troubled. As we're about to find out in this devotional, we read in Exodus 2:11 that Moses grows and becomes an adult. Now we skip forward very much into his life, 40 years actually. Stephen also tells us that in his sermon in Acts 7:23. During those 4 decades, we don't know how much contact Moses had with his Israelite family. But clearly, he knows he's a Hebrew, and he knows his people have been oppressed for a long time. So imagine the tension that Moses feels. Growing up, he knows that his people are being oppressed by his adopted family. He's living it up while the rest of his family's being tortured. Kind of wonder, how long has he been thinking about this? How long has he been feeling this building up inside of him? All we know is that one day, Moses sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave, and Moses snaps. Clearly, the injustice being perpetrated against his people, it has been growing like a crushing wave inside of him, because he lashes out, kills the Egyptian, and hides his body, thinking no one saw. But someone saw. In fact, the next day, as he is interacting with some of the Hebrew slaves, they tell him that they saw, and it freaks Moses out. He didn't think anybody knew. He thought he was in the clear. And worse yet, the Pharaoh finds out. This Pharaoh was very likely Moses' adopted grandfather, maybe adopted father. Historians are uncertain. This is a man, though, that has been very involved in Moses' life for those 40 years. And he tries to kill Moses. Talk about family drama for Moses. Well, Moses can't stay there. Obviously, he has to escape. His life is threatened. And so he heads away from Egypt to Midian. Midian is due east of Egypt and directly south of modern-day Israel, which was called Canaan in those days. Now, we don't know exactly how far Moses traveled. Reports will tell you all sorts of numbers. But more than likely, he was walking for a long time, at least a week, until he came upon a well there in Midian. And he met some women. He finds out they are daughters of a local Midianite priest named Jethro. Right at that same time, at the well, some shepherds show up, and they try to force the women away from the well so that they can feed or water their sheep. Well, Moses sticks up for Jethro's daughters, and he makes sure that the women have space there at the well so that they can get water. The daughters report this to their father, and Jethro is overjoyed. The next thing we know, Jethro is giving his daughter's hand in marriage to Moses, his daughter named Zipporah. And then we read that Zipporah and Moses have a baby boy named Gershom. I don't know about you, but this story is moving lightning fast. We're 10 verses in, and think about all that has happened. Moses has lived as Egyptian royalty for 40 years. He's killed an Egyptian. He's had to run away to Midian. He gets married and has a baby son. Now, how many years have passed during all of that? I don't know. But the narrative is not about to slow down just yet. Because in verse 23 of Exodus chapter 2, we learn that another long period of time passes by. Moses is there in Midian, Stephen tells us, again in that sermon in Acts chapter 6, for 40 more years. So Moses is now 80 years old. And in those 40 years, while Moses is in Midian, we learn that the angry Egyptian Pharaoh dies. Now remember, that was either his grandfather or his father. So the new Pharaoh would either be Moses' adopted father or brother. The movie, the animated movie, The Prince of Egypt, suggests it's his brother. We don't know for sure. But 40 years have gone by. How will that new Pharaoh think about Moses? Is he at all thinking about Moses? Does he remember him? Certainly he must remember him. Moses lived with him for 40 years. Will this new Pharaoh let bygones be bygones? Will Moses just stay in Midian and avoid that whole soap opera of the royal Egyptian court? For now, we leave those questions unanswered to address a much more important question. Where is God in all of this? Leaving Moses in Midian, the narrator of the story now draws our attention back to Egypt. And we learn that in those 40 years that Moses was in Midian, things have not changed for the nation of Israel in slavery. It has been oppression, awful oppression. They are burdened under the crushing weight of slavery, and we read in verse 23 that the people cry out to God for help. This word that he uses for crying out is used other places as the image of a woman who is screaming out in the pangs of childbirth. And in verses 24 and 25, listen to these amazing words. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. Now, I just read from the New International Version, and twice in verses 23 and 24, it uses the word groaning for the Israelites. There's actually two different Hebrew words here. One is a groaning with a sighing, and the other one is more of a standard word of groaning. Either way, these enslaved Israelites are just deeply upset. It's hugely emotional. But what do we read? God hears them. He sees them. He remembers. and he is also concerned. Some people believe God is distant. The philosophy of deism suggests that God exists, but he's not involved in the universe he created. Deists believe that God set the universe in motion and now is hands off. It's almost like a bowler who has his fingers holding the ball, and as the bowler goes to the lane, he is choosing an angle, a height. He is choosing spin and speed, and then he launches the ball. And as the ball slides out of his hand, the bowler just watches. He can't influence its pathway anymore. It's all up to physics now. Most often, the bowler is standing there at the beginning of the lane with one arm outstretched that has just launched the ball, one leg back usually, watching what's going to happen. Deists see God this way, just sitting back as the universe unfolds century after century. It's out of his hands. But in Exodus 2, 24 and 25, we just read a very different view of God. We don't read about a deist God. We read about a God who is involved. God hears the groaning of his enslaved people. He remembers his covenant with their ancestors. God looks and sees and is concerned. Do you hear the emotion? Do you feel the emotion of God in this passage? Because of that emotion, we need to talk about another philosophy. Some philosophies describe God as immutable. Immutable means unable to be changed. Now, clearly, Scripture teaches that God is unchanging, and yet there is a debate among Jewish and Christian philosophers about whether it's correct to describe God as immutable. Does immutability mean God can't feel anything? If immutability means that God is unaffected, that God is unemotional, then I disagree with that version of God. Here in Exodus 2, we meet a God who is caring and loving. He's relational. He's emotional. He is concerned for his people. Our God is a God who sees you. He sees what you're going through. He cares about you emotionally and relationally, and it affects him. What you're going through affects him. So you can cry out to him. You can know that he hears you. This crying out, whether it's a groaning or a sighing, it's something most of us know well. Most of us have those difficult situations in our lives. So this groaning and crying out is synonymous with the concept of lament. Lament is sometimes defined as holy complaint, and the Psalms are loaded with lament, asking God to wake up, to act, to intervene. Some lament is shockingly bold, accusing God as being hypocritical, almost saying, "You said you had my back, God, but where are you?" Maybe you felt that way before. Maybe you've thought those kinds of thoughts and you've even wondered, oh my goodness, I can't believe I'm thinking this. Is God going to smite me? No. And know this. Not only is he not going to smite you, you are not alone. That kind of raw, honest lament is what those enslaved Israelites were doing. And how does God respond? By smiting them? No. By seeing them, by hearing them, remembering and caring. That kind of love is how God responds to his people who lament. So cry out to him, groan, sigh, reach out to him, and get ready for God's loving action. Now in Exodus 2, so far, we don't yet know what his action is. We're going to find out soon enough, and that will be next week. For now, cry out to him. Contemplate God. Reach out to him and let him know exactly what you're thinking and feeling. Because he is a God who hears, who sees, who cares. He loves you.